Good evening, everyone.
Good
You're
evening.
all welcome to you're all welcome to today's lecture. We're very glad to have you here. Good evening, our elders, our dear professors, and distinguished friends. I also want to welcome the presenters for today. Interestingly, in PrAN, we don't always like a vacuum. We all know that Professor Babatunde was supposed to present today, but he is unavoidably absent. So we have made plans for scholars of great minds like Dr. David Nya, Dr. Simeon Ajiboye, and Dr. Ibilate Warigonayo to discuss using data to examine key considerations in pragmatism. And that is a follow-up to the lecture presented by Professor Debole last week. We do hope that you will enjoy it. Like I said in the post, it's a practical session, so we'll expect your contributions and your attendance. Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Mr. Tomere Dubamu, who will moderate today's lecture. I now hand over. Dr. Anya, you are welcome. I can see you. Dr. Bibian Lugwala, you are welcome. Thank you very
Thank
much for
you.
coming on here. Mr. Tomere Dubamo, I want to hand over to you to introduce our presenter, Dr. Inya, who is there as well. Thank you very much. Mr. Dubamo, Mr. Dubamo, wow.
I don't think he has come online.
He came online earlier. Is Dubamo there? Okay, if he's not here yet, can we just go right and start the program? Dr. Inya,
Yes.
thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much, Dr. Mrs. It's always a pleasure to speak on pragmatics. Also a pleasure to be of service to PrAN. Also a pleasure to be of service to the president, my boss, Professor Akin Odebomi. Constantly a pleasure. So I am going to share my screen from which I would speak. And then when the other panelists are able to come online, they will then pick up from where I stop, or they would also speak to their slides. So this is me sharing my screen. Okay, I'm sure the screen is visible now. So the goal of this panel session or panel discussion is to provide database explanation to some key considerations in pragmatics analysis, which our boss, Professor Debomi, talked about on the 11th of September 2020. And the link is provided for those who have not seen the video to look it up. It's a distinguished lecture that would benefit anybody interested in pragmatics analysis. This session would be talk will in this session. Three panelists are involved: myself, yours truly, Dr. Onwinya, then Dr. Simon Ajiboye and Ibelate Naye. While Dr. Simon and I will illustrate the top-down analytical approach, Dr. Naye will speak to the key considerations as contained in the lecture. So we sort of had a distribution of tasks while we illustrate with data certain mappings of analytical approach in pragmatics analysis. Dr. Naye will draw on her thesis to illustrate the key considerations that Professor Debomi talked about on the 11th of September. So my job is to speak to the form function mapping. It's a top-down approach which begins from the researcher first identifying linguistic features that the text provides, and then linking those linguistic features to language functions. And by form, since it's pragmatics analysis, we mean pragmatic forms, and also functions, we mean pragmatic functions. Culpeper and Hogg, 2004, give a nice definition of pragmatic forms and functions, although from a broad perspective, but we can narrow it down for the benefit of our lecture. Pragmatic forms are of particular language that is to respond with a yes or no. In the social media language, this is drawing from our cultural context now. If someone says, "Egungun, be careful," that form has, in that context of social media discourse, has come to be linked to the function of a cautionary tale about being careful, otherwise there might be dire consequences for such an action. Or is it in the emoji discourse where putting your hands together can mean you are saying thank you? That is a form, or could mean you are requesting and pleading, or could mean namaste in Indian, which is an expression of appreciation for what has been done. So we see that form and function can be mapped. Of course, there might be a one-to-one mapping in some cases, maybe in the narrow context of interaction, but in the larger context, which is a pragmatic context, the pragmatic forces work on the function of that form. We'll illustrate this as we progress in the lecture. Also, it should be noted that as Culpeper and Hogg identified, the notion of forms should be taken broadly. It can vary from a grammatical particle to a gerund. It could also include forms of nonverbal behavior, just like I illustrated with putting your hands together in emoji discourse. So this is the definition of form we are adopting. Function focuses on the nature of pragmatic functions of a particular language, in this case, the English language. For example, its range of speech acts and how individual speech acts perform particular functions, such that if, for instance, the priest say, "I pronounce you man and wife," that particular form has a specific function to say you are now married. You are now accepted to, you may kiss the bride if you like. So outside of that particular form, outside of that particular context, that form may not have that specific meaning. We'll look at these issues as we progress. So I am going to illustrate with the theory of pragmatic act or pragma, which is basically a form function theory. and he holds that pragmatic act functions of situated speech acts or pragmatic acts are constrained by the affordances of the situation. Capone 2005 says that a pragma is a situated speech act in which the rules of language and of society synergize in determining meaning intended as a socially recognizable object, sensitive to social expectations about the situation in which the utterance to be interpreted is uttered. In other words, pragma result from a fusion of pragmatic forms with the context of that particular pragmatic form and the social expectations about ways of speaking or acting in that particular discourse. So you can see there are levels of embedding. So as you can see in the slide, you identify the particular pragmatic form you intend to focus on. You see how that form is contextualized within the context surrounding text, and then the social expectation of that interaction. Then, since we're talking about pragmatics analysis, you have to check to see that the resulting product is consistent with the ways of speaking or acting in that discourse, maybe the activity type of that discourse or the genre of that discourse. We'll illustrate this as we go ahead. So, first illustration. In this illustration, it's an example taken from a paper in 2016, which looked at humor in chat rooms of university students. So this particular example was posted on March 28, 2015, 2011, which was the year of election. So this is the excerpt. Weather forecast has shown that there will be heavy downpour in southern Nigeria. So get your umbrellas, guys, and drop the broom. This is a form. As a form, we could see it as a complex sentence. I'm just using simple grammatical identifiers to identify it, or as an imperative sentence where it says, so get your umbrellas, guys, and drop the broom. In the narrow context of this specific example, it is forecasting, weather forecast. The specific speech act function is advising people to get their umbrellas or warning them against the possibility of a downpour. Generally, getting them to prepare for the weather of the day. However, the larger context of this excerpt is predicting election outcomes and humor, in which case the pragmatic function would then be teasing. Look at it closely. When he says weather forecast, the date of the excerpt is, like I said, March 28, which was the month of election. This broader context of election prediction and humor implies that our initial interpretation of advice and warning relative to weather condition will no longer hold. The function now being embedded in a larger context produces a different pragmatic function, though maybe tied to advising and warning. But then in this case, advising and warning with a tongue-in-cheek, like, there's going to be trouble if you don't drop the umbrella, if you don't drop the brooms and pick the umbrella. So the larger context of election contesting, in which the parties PDP featured and APC featured, and then the sociocultural knowledge that umbrella is a symbol for PDP while the broom is a symbol for APC begins to come into play in this larger context. In other words, our initial interpretation of that form will then begin to revise that particular interpretation to ensure that this current social context or social expectations of that particular form is brought to bear. What this does is that it illustrates what Capone calls the transformative effect of context in pragmatic act. The larger context that works on this form that seemed like a weather forecast changes it into a pragmatic act of teasing when we see that it's occurring in a larger context of election predicting and humor. So Capone 2005 observes that such transformation reshaped the original locutionary value of a speech act by adding contextual layers of meaning or even may change the illusionary value of the speaker, just like we saw that with the weather forecast, when we add the layer of the broom being a symbol for APC, and then we add the contextual layer of the umbrella being a symbol for PDP, then we add the contextual layer of the setting of that particular utterance, the time frame occurring when elections were ongoing. We then see that it is no longer advising or warning relative to weather outcomes, but relative to electoral outcomes, and then functions as a pragmatic act of teasing. A second illustration is taken from my thesis, which examined meaning construction and ideology in legislative debate, which was, of course, supervised by our president, Professor Akin Odebomi. In this example, what happens here is that the Senate leader seeks the permission of the Senate president to start the lead debate. And the form we are looking at specifically now highlighted in the slide is with your kind permission. I wish to seek your permission to start the lead debate. The president, Senate leader, you may start the lead debate. The first thing to note is that the form is co-constructed because it's contributed to both by the Senate leader and the Senate president. So in this case, the form is an interactional, it's an interaction in the sense of not just a single turn, but turn placed side by side. There's sequentiality in the data. In other words, the form is co-constructed. What we see in this example is that that form of seeking permission, ties in with the function of receiving permission from the Senate president to start the lead debate. Like I said, the linguistic form for this particular act is with your kind permission. I wish to seek your permission to start the lead debate. And then the corresponding act granting the request is equally implemented through the deontic model of permission, namely, Senate leader, you may start the lead debate. This particular act of seeking and granting permission must be done before the lead debate can be undertaken. This speaks to the fact that form and function have to operate within the larger social expectation of that discourse or ways of speaking and acting. In other words, the genre requirement of that discourse. Let's tinker with this data, for instance. Let's assume the Senate leader refuses to ask permission before he starts the lead debate. He's going to be ruled out of order because he has once kept the acceptable form for that particular sequential act, and two, he has not received the meaning that should be executed at that particular stage of interaction is lost. So form function has to agree both within the local context of that interaction and the social larger expectation of that interaction. For instance, this further speaks to the fact that the legislative debate in the Nigerian Senate is a regulated discourse, which actions, both verbal and non-verbal, must be regulated by rules and conventions. Like I said, the form is co-constructed by the two speakers. The function is equally co-constructed. It's constructed across the sequential organization of that interaction. Also, it is consistent with the ways of speaking and acting in legislative discourse. In other words, this dance between form and function is constrained by the genre requirements of the type of interaction. If you recall, where we explain pragmatic act as a function theory, which also helps us link form with function, we indicated that 1, the researcher identifies the linguistic form. 2, sees how it is contextualized in the local, in the context and in the social expectation of that particular discourse. 3, to check that the resulting product is consistent with ways of speaking and acting in that particular discourse. We've illustrated that in this particular data. The third illustration is focused on also legislative discourse, and the excerpt is from a senator. He says the Nigerian democracy must be consolidated and strengthened. This institution remains a very important and crucial part of our democracy. The legislature is the engine room of our democracy. The form I am interested in here is highlighted. The legislature is the engine room of our democracy. Form, metaphor, because the source concept of engine room is applied to the target concept of democracy, which is not a concrete object, which is an idea, which is a social system. But the idea, the concrete, tangible idea of the engine room is linked, is mapped onto democracy. That makes it a conceptual metaphor. Maslow, for instance, 2006, argues that we should move beyond just identifying conceptual metaphors to identifying what he calls metaphor scenarios. Metaphor scenarios are discourse-based metaphors that carry 1, attitudinal meaning, 2, ideological meaning, 3, argumentative meaning, 4, and bears the context, the social context of the interaction. So let's illustrate this. 1, in terms of attitude, we see that this person expresses a positive attitude towards the legislature by positively evaluating it as the engine room of our democracy. 2, we see that in terms of ideology, it dichotomizes between the legislature as the engine room of democracy with the other arms of the Nigerian government, which if it is a case of negative order presentation, we will see that it seems to imply that this form seems to imply that other arms of the Nigerian government may not contribute as much as the legislature does to the sustenance, to the growth, to the strengthening of democracy. 3, in terms of argumentation, by indicating that the legislature is the engine room of our democracy, this person invites the argumentative conclusion that the legislature is central to the consolidation and strengthening of democracy. You can see how this form begins to perform various levels of function. When we pair it with various functions within that context, we see that pragmatic act and pragmatic meaning begins to emerge. And lastly, in terms of agreeing with the context of the interaction, we can see that in this case, you would almost know that it is a data from an emerging democracy. If you talk about consolidation and strengthening, I almost might be, except I investigate further, I can almost bet that the word to consolidate and strengthen democracy may not be very frequent in the congressional debate of that democracy is strengthened. Of course, with recent happenings, that's a different debate entirely. But my point is this: let's look at the first expression, which is an assertion. The lexical items consolidated and strengthened point to a context of an emerging democracy. You see how form, function, agrees or works within the confines of the context of that interaction. So form, metaphor, function, legitimizing the institution of the legislature. Let's dwell on this a little. This is an ideological statement. This is an ideological move that is based on the metaphor, the legislature is the engine room of our democracy. In other words, if we stopped at identifying it merely as mappings between source domain and target domain, between engine room and democracy, and we stop at that level of conceptual metaphor, these other meanings will not emerge from the form we're looking at. But when we then move to the level of scenarios, stories about the stories that this metaphor tell, like I said, this form tells the story of an emerging democracy. This metaphor tells the story of a democracy within which the legislature is constantly harassed, victimized. It is known historically that whenever there's a coup d'etat, the legislature is the first arm of government to go. Of course, the executive is subsumed under the military government. The judiciary is left, but of course also controlled by the military. But the legislature is constantly taken out. So it speaks, they tells us the story historically of a legislature that has constantly been marginalized, victimized, maligned, taken out of the picture. This metaphor scenario, this particular form, tells us the story of a legislature that is seeking to assert itself, assert its relevance, its importance, its criticality to the furtherance of the democratic enterprise of Nigeria. And it also tells the story of a democracy that is coming to terms with the importance of the legislature. All these stories, what Maslow calls metaphor scenarios, emerges from the data one, emerges from looking at the form. The legislature is the engine room of democracy. So you see, by pairing this form with its context, we begin to get various function. So the function in this case, one function, for instance, is legitimizing the institution of the legislature. But if we were to extend this form a little more, the analysis a little more, you would see that it speaks to almost a manipulative position where it seems to assume that only the legislature is relevant in a democracy. Only the legislature is relevant in sustaining democracy, because this form gives us that meaning, gives us that pragmatic understanding that other arms of government may not be relevant for the consolidation of democracy. But that's manipulative, and that is also a different story entirely. The larger context that makes this meaning, this function to emerge, is a tenuous relationship between the legislative and the executive arms of the Nigerian government. This is no news, that there is constant tension between these two arms of government. So if we insert this form, this metaphoric form in that context, then we begin to understand the function of it operating as a legitimizing device for the legislature. So far, what we have tried to illustrate is that in a pragmatics analysis, when you pair form and function, issues begin to emerge from your data. Issues, meanings, and arguments begin to emerge from your data. So, in conclusion, for this section of the presentation, we see that form to function mapping requires that the researcher, researcher starts by one, specifically identifying the pragmatic form that is necessary for its interaction. One of the illustrations, we saw the identification of a metaphoric pragmatic form. Two, contextualizing, or rather seeing how that is contextualized within the context and the social expectations of the interaction. Three, checking that the resulting product is consistent with the ways of speaking and acting in that discourse. Like Professor Debumi said, the result of a pragmatics analysis is challenging intellectually, but also rewarding, especially if your analysis portrays the reality of the goings on in that data. If the product you have presented represents what actually happens in that particular data, then your analysis would have achieved its objective. For this session of the presentation, thank you very much for listening. I will then hand over to the coordinators, and then we might speak to the slide by Dr. Waribonaye. Thank you very much.
So that I can. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Iya. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
That was wonderful. It was so detailed, and actually, it's the usual. I think I expected that. I never expected less. It was wonderful. Absolutely. Now, without time, we're going to be having another session. At least the Telegram session will also be coming up. So the next presenter if it's Dr. Waribonaye that is presently available, and I believe the slides are with you. I don't know if you are taking it in our stead.
Yes, I have the slides.
Okay, but is she available for the presentation?
No, she's not. So I will speak to her slides.
Well, Dr. Simeon Ajiboye is also there. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome, sir. So I think let
let's hold on for the advert. After the advert, we go on. Okay? Tomorrow, can you hear me? Yeah. So just let's hold on for the advert. After the advert, we go on. Okay? So when the advert finishes, so we go on. I'm going to run the advert one more time. Okay? Just nod if you can hear me. Okay, so I'm running the advert one more time. One more time.
Right. To all panelists that are connecting to this particular discussion series, I welcome you all back to this platform. We want to move ahead after having listened to the phenomenal and wonderful presentation by our Dr. Inya David. And we have to call on Dr. Simeon Ajiboye to continue with the presentation since Dr. Naye is not readily available. We will take that in proxy, and at least Dr. Inya will be representing her as well. So at this time, I would love to welcome Dr. Simeon Ajiboye, who will be taking his own part of the presentation. Dr. Simeon, you are welcome, sir. Hello, please. Can you please hear me? Can you hear me, Dr. Simeon? Hello, Dr. Simeon, are you there? Dr. Ajiboye. Hello. The next presentation.
Zubamo,
by
Zubamo, can you hear me? Zubamo, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Okay.
Let's have a break. I
can hear you.
Ajiboye is having issues with the internet.
Okay.
So I think it's fine.
Are we switching to AMC?
I'm going to stop this.
All right.
So let's
He's
get
back.
He's coming back now. Yes.
The network is bad here. Network is very terrible here for me.
Yeah, it's the same thing here. I'm finding it hard to connect, but at least we are making do with what we have.
It's raining. It's raining quite currently now.
Okay.
It's raining at my end. I don't know if I can just speak briefly, then we move on to the platform. It's already time for us to go to the platform so that people will not be waiting for.
Yeah, I think the platform time is 6:30 according to what I have here.
Okay. All right. If we can talk just briefly.
Okay, please, Dr. Simeon Ajiboye, can we just have you briefly, at least for 15 minutes, so that we can take that of Dr. Waribonai. Please, you are on.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm actually about to speak to the analysis from function to form. And in this place, I'm trying to share my slides so that we can possibly see what is there. And I will be using about 3 theories. We're using social constructionist theory of identity. We're using Discourse, DHA by Ruth Wodak, and as well I'll be using construction grammar. The essence is just to see, the essence is actually to see the interplay of all these theories and how they are able to interact to produce meaning. I mean, from function, that means the functionally used part of language to the linguistic items that we have in the data and how they interact to produce meaning. And social construction, let me just talk about social construction. I don't know, maybe if we can see I'm trying to share my screen. If possibly we could see it. Now, what the social construction theory of identity is all about is just about the identity is not static, the identity is dynamic. It's actually something that has to go against the essentialism approach of identity being static. It goes beyond using name, using onomastic, using color, using what's happening to create identity. It is occasion, it's actually in discourse. And that's what we are talking about social constructionism. That we are talking about identity that is created, that is emanated in discourse, in interaction. And I know that we have talked about the idea of construction grammar in the course of our lecture, especially in the first series that we have. So we really need to look at this, how the interplay between the construction grammar and the social construction identity theory, how they interplay to produce a particular class of identity, as well to foreground a particular class of identity. I don't know if we can see my slide. I'm trying to share the screen. If James will allow about that. Okay, more of this we will definitely see when we get to that platform. Now let's see the interplay of this. I will read out a particular interaction, very short interaction, and I'm going to speak to it. Now we have speaker A speaking. You were the one financing the house. Then we have
I think we have. I think we are. Dr. Simeon is really having trouble connecting to the platform. What do you suggest we do? Should we wait a little and then maybe we allow Dr. Onya to?
Well, I think Dr. Inya should go ahead with the second slide, and then we migrate into
So
the
now we can just move to the platform, to Telegram platform. So, Dr. Onya, as we wait for, we just have you, please.
All right, thank you, Jubana. I'm sharing the slide now. Thank you. So I'm speaking on behalf of Dr. Belate Warebonai, who couldn't be here because of certain family emergencies that she had to attend to. She sends her apologies, and of course, I know she's apologetic about her not being here. And I'll just speak to the key issues in her slide before we then go to the Telegram page. So, like I said earlier, her focus is to demonstrate the key considerations. What Dr. Ajiboye and I were to do was to illustrate the form to function mapping and function to form mapping that occurs in a pragmatics analysis. As the slide shows, is to demonstrate how these key considerations for a pragmatics analysis were guided her thesis, which definitely was supervised by our president, Professor Akin Odebumi. So I'll speak to the key issues in our presentation, and then we'll move to the Telegram page where we can interact more. So she begins to address the considerations from consideration 2, which says that the nature of data, objective/research question informs the choice of theory. Her data had to do with clerics' utterances on Boko Haram in selected online media. That's data. Her objective was to identify and discuss. One objective was to identify and discuss the perspectives of selected Nigerian clerics in media on the Boko Haram discourse. And in order to identify perspectives, she adopted appraiser theory. And if you're familiar with appraiser theory, the engagement resources in appraiser system has to do with the intersubjective negotiation of perspectives or perspectivizing, if you like. So there is an element of acknowledgement, there's the element of concurrence, there's the element of counter argument or counter positioning, there's the element of denial, there's the element of endorsement, entertainment, and pronouncement. And so you can see how her data and her objective matches the kind of theory she has. There is no mismatch between data, objective, and theory, which is what we see sometimes in certain analysis where your data cannot be accounted, cannot be accommodated with theory, and it becomes a very clumsy pragmatics analysis. So as Prof indicated, there has to be a match between data, objective, and theory. 2, the next consideration, the data nature and researcher interest determine the number of theories or account of theoretical insights to be selected from favored theories. So in the case of her thesis, one of her objectives were 1, to identify and discuss the perspectives of selected Nigerian clerics in the media on Boko Haram discourse. In order to identify perspective, like I said earlier, engagement resources were deployed. 2, second objective, to identify the stance types and their features that foreground the perspectives, in which case she then had to look at stance theory, stance types, and features as manifested in Beber's work 2006 and Martin and White's work 2005, where they gave lexicosemantic markers of stance type, either epistemic, affective, and what have you. 3, to examine the pragmatic strategies deployed by the clerics and their pragmatic implications in the discourse. In order to identify strategies, pragmatic strategies that affect ideological functions, she drew on Van Dijk's ideological strategies, and then also relied on Pragmatic Act Theory of May to provide a very robust analysis. What this illustrates, just like consideration 1, is that there shouldn't be a mismatch between theory, objectives, and data. Otherwise, the work may not stand thorough scrutiny. It will just collapse under intense scrutiny. Number 4, analytical principles are not only theories. They are, in addition, concepts and principles derived from literature and other non-selected theories for a study. So, in order to account for stance type, what Dr. Naye did was to review literature on stance type, where we have evidentiality, epistemic, and affect. These are not theories in themselves, they are concepts, because evidentiality can be examined from either in terms of discourse markers, or in terms of pragmatics, or in terms of epistemic proximization So you can see that different theories can attend to the question of evidentiality, epistemic stance, and then affect. So what she did was go into the literature, harvest concepts that are relevant for analysis, and then supplement the concepts with the theory she's chosen. You see that kind of, it provides a very robust analytical framework. And just like Prof said, a very highly intellectual person then draws a design. If you work with Prof, you always have to come up with a framework, and it is very useful because it guides your research. It gives you a photographic, a pictorial representation of what your analysis, what your entire work looks like. So principles can supplement theories, concept from literature in that area can supplement theory, just like Dr. Waribonaye has illustrated here. 5. A pragmatic analysis of necessity makes a statement overtly or covertly about context, where context covers participant setting or discursive, interactive, or discourse conditions. For participant in her data, she identifies stance takers. In this case, the authorial voices of the speaker and the actual potential or invoke or imagined reader of that media discourse. 2. The object of the analysis was stance, Boko Haram insurgent terrorist discourse. The participant space was a online media report, and then the mental setting, if you like, was a socio-religious context that surrounded that discourse, or that informed or provided a frame for understanding that discourse. And then there was the physical setting of Nigeria, specifically the northeastern region, and then the discourse conditions for the National Peace Project within the socio-religious context of the Christian and the Islamic faith. So you see again consistency. And to conform with pragmatics analysis dictates that the pragmatics analysis dictates of context constraints the selection of data was purposive, ensures that the selection of data in pragmatics analysis is purposive, so that only utterances that refer to Boko Haram and is connected to its agencies or agents, that's apologies rule, and the festered and aided Boko Haram activities were extracted from the report. In other words, your focus has to be with the forms that are of interest to your analysis, not everything. In the case of Dr. Naya's thesis, she concentrated strictly on utterances by religious people vis-a-vis Boko Haramic activity. That was her data. Those forms of of expression then informed her analysis, within which she brought out the functions that those forms were made to accomplish. And then we have consideration 4, to carry out pragmatics analysis. It is compulsory to clearly understand the concepts, nature, and principles of pragmatic theories employed. In order to do this, what does the concept mean? Here, engagement as a component of appraisal system deals with how these resources are deployed to show differences in the way the textual voices engage with alternative voices and or points of view being referenced or activated by the text. So she illustrated that in her analysis. And then what can it help to determine? It helped to determine the locutions used by authorial voices to position itself with respect to other voices in the text. We will, as we go back to the Telegram, we'll provide detailed discussions and analysis to this consideration. All right. The seventh consideration, in the example provided, the textual voice dialogically engages an alternative position which attributes the activities of Boko Haram to poverty. He does this by invoking the external voice's position and displays the resources of counter to fend off that view and to present his own point of view that Boko Haram is a product of religious ideology, not poverty, as proposed by his dialogic opponent and alternative voice. I think we should look at that data. That's excerpt 3. Boko Haram is fueled by extreme religious ideology and not poverty, because they have not come out to tell us that they are killing people because they are poor or hungry. What this authorial voice does is to entertain an alternative position that states that Boko Haram activity is fueled by poverty, and then to counter that position by stating his own position that it is fueled by extreme ideological systems. In this case, we see an engagement of voices countering and presenting your own point of view. It goes back to our objective of identifying perspectives, identifying stance in the data. You can see how consistently this work deals with data, theory, data, research question, and theory. And that consistency manifests even in the analysis. And I think that's all from the presentation by that Dr. Waribo Naya presented. But it's key. It illustrates all the most of the key considerations in the lecture by Professor Debomi with lived example of our PhD thesis. Dubami, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
On Telegram will be more explorative and will be more insightful. We'll be able to engage it. We are already running out of the time that is allotted for us here on this virtual presentation. So, Dr. Inya, we really appreciate you, and Dr. Vivian, thank you so much, and our technical man, Dr. James, you'll be wonderful. So, I don't know, whatever question, any question anybody is having right now, we have to move to the Telegram platform and you can ask. There we will have to read through all these papers and get a better knowledge of what has been presented. So far, it's been a wonderful time, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So,
So,